Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're kicking off the 2020 year-end list with my top 5 least favorite albums of 2020. Now, this was a list that was kind of interesting for me to put together because overall 2020 was a year that, in the eyes of many people, myself included, it was pretty terrible overall. And I'm not just bringing this up to, bring it up. I'm more so bringing it up because I think in the greater scheme of this year, bad music was the least of my worries, I guess. It's just not one of those things that was on my mind all that much. It didn't really bother me all that much. I mean, sure, there were bad albums I heard, and they weren't pleasant to listen to, but they didn't really stick with me this year as much as they did in previous years. There was just so much worse going on in the world. I just couldn't really find myself to be bothered with caring that much about, music of all things in this regard. But at the end of the day, I still ended up hearing some bad records, so today I am going to be sharing with you guys, as I have done in years past, my least favorite picks from this year. And this year I'm just doing 5 as opposed to 10 because I didn't really hear all that many truly awful releases this year. I guess I just happened to pick projects that I ended up enjoying more than I didn't when it came to the projects I decided to check out. And also because, again, I just found it hard to be really all that upset with bad music this year. So if I don't seem super, angry or upset or anything in this video, that's why, because most of the music here on this list didn't really anger me. It just disappointed me a lot, and it bored me a lot of the time too. Those were really the biggest emotions I felt walking away from the 5 picks here today. So yeah, let's not waste any more time. Of course, as per all my other lists here on the channel, this is just my own personal opinion. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. And this is just based on all the albums that I happen to hear in 2020. If a terrible album that you heard isn't on the list, it could mean that I like the album, or it could mean that I just didn't hear it. And I mean, feel free to leave your own least favorite list of projects from this year in the comment section down below. If you want to share some other terrible picks, I'll make sure to check it out so I can make myself a little mental list of projects to avoid going forward. But yeah, again, enough stalling. Let's get to my number 5 pick. This is the second studio album from the Stone Temple Pilots with their newest vocalist, and I know a lot of people didn't really care for that first record they dropped with him back in 2018. Personally, I liked the record more than most people did, though I still felt like it was a pretty mediocre project through and through. I felt like the production on it wasn't as heavy as it needed to be, and overall the songwriting just wasn't the most original or interesting, but there were some moments on that project that reminded me of why Stone Temple Pilots are a band that's worth caring about, and I was hoping that that record being really mediocre was just more so the side effect of it being, kind of a transitional record, their first project with a new vocalist. And I was hoping that going forward, things would be maybe a bit more interesting because they'd be a bit more comfortable with everybody in the band at that point. And coming into this second album here, the interesting thing is that this ends up being a bad record, not because it doubles down on a lot of the weaknesses of 2018's self-titled record, but more so because of completely original and unique reasons that I didn't really see coming. The thing is that this is certainly not a generic release in the band's catalog. In fact, it's probably one of the more unique records to come out of the Stone Temple Pilots discography, because this is an all-acoustic record, and that alone is kind of interesting on paper. However, unfortunately, a lot of these songs on this thing just are not super interesting in their own right. There's just very little here on this record that's actually interesting to listen to. All the instrumentals here are pretty bland. You do have some harmonica thrown into a few of the tracks here that is kind of interesting, but it's not interesting enough to really make these instrumentals stand out all that much. And the vocals here, while the new vocalist that they have is, a fine enough performer, I guess, he just doesn't really have the distinct character that made previous releases in this band really stand out. He just sounds really generic, especially over these instrumentals here. This whole project just ends up feeling like a really generic throwaway acoustic rock record that I would not expect to come out of a band with as big of a reputation as the Stone Temple Pilots. I feel like they should be making more hard-hitting music than something like this. Not necessarily in the sense that it needs to be super heavy or anything. I think the whole concept behind this record being acoustic is pretty interesting on its own. And previous, songs from this group have shown that they can do songs in this direction in a way that's interesting and engaging, but Unfortunately, on this record, that just never ends up being the case. This just ends up feeling like a super forgettable record. It's one that every time I finish listening to it, I just like pretty much forget it immediately. And given that I haven't seen people really talk about it throughout most of this year, when this thing came out pretty early on in the year, I'm guessing it was kind of forgettable in the eyes of most other people too. So yeah, let's just go back to forgetting this release and hoping that maybe the next record from these guys will be a bit more interesting. So yeah, I kind of respect this record on some regard for trying something new, but man, it just was not interesting in the slightest. My next pick on the list is one of the more disappointing albums here, in my opinion. I've never been like the biggest Royce da 5'9" fan or anything like that, though I have enjoyed his music to some extent in the past, and I felt like his 2018 record, the one that came out prior to this one, Book of Ryan, was probably his best album to date. Overall, I felt like a really focused project, a really personal one too. All the performances on it were pretty solid. Wasn't a perfect record by any means, but I still found myself really enjoying it. So I was looking forward to his next full-length offering, especially given that this was also going to be a conceptual project. And yeah, this is a conceptual project, but there's still a lot of other things about this record that just kind of hold it down from being enjoyable, in my opinion. The production here is pretty mediocre. I mean, it's not awful, but at the same time, it's not really all that memorable either. The hooks here aren't anything all that special. The features are kind of mediocre too. The whole record feels really bloated as well. And really the most positive thing I could say about this record is that Royce's rapping is pretty solid throughout this thing, though he's always been a pretty solid rapper, and that's still very much the case here on this project. But when going back to the faults with this record, the thing that I think really holds this thing down the most might actually be the concept and lyrics and themes of this thing. Not that the general concept behind this thing is bad by any means. Royce is talking about social and political issues here on this record, and while it is something that has been done before by other artists, I don't think that it's necessarily a bad topic to cover, especially in a year like 2020. But the execution does leave a lot to be desired, in my opinion. When it's just Royce talking about issues like racism and things of that sort, it's actually pretty okay here. He does make some solid points here, even if, again, they're not the most original ones ever. However, there are some moments that do kind of undermine this record's core ideas, I feel. Moments of misogyny, homophobia, anti-vax bars as well in the lyrics here on this thing. And these are issues that normally I don't like on projects for reasons that should be obvious, but typically I can overlook them sometimes if they feel really isolated and they don't really drag down the experience of the project as a whole. But that's not the case here on The Allegory, because like I said before, with the very pro-black message of this record, the fact that Royce seems to just completely look over, black women, black gay people, and the like here on this project does leave the core message behind this record feeling not quite as sturdy as it should really be. And in a year like 2020, where there was quite a lot of pro-black music that was really good and had really solid ideas going for it, this just doesn't really hold up in comparison. Again, there are some moments on this thing where Royce does make some, solid points, and again, the rapping at times is enjoyable as well. But again, I just feel like there's a lot of other projects out there that fall into a similar category as this one does, that just do what this record's trying to do, but quite a lot better. Especially, again, in a year like 2020, it just leaves this project feeling really weak in comparison and kind of regressive in comparison to some of the more forward-thinking and progressive pieces of music in a similar vein to this one. So yeah, overall this just ended up being a pretty big disappointment in my opinion. The rapping is for the most part pretty okay, but everything else just let me down for the most part, yeah. While The Allegory was a pretty big disappointment for me this year, it wasn't the biggest disappointment. That honor would have to go to the newest from Green Day, Father of All. Green Day are one of my favorite bands of all time. They're a band that was pretty responsible for getting me into music as much as I'm currently in. I'm not sure if I'd be here right now making these videos if it wasn't for me getting into these guys back when I did many years ago. But with all of that said, this record is just like painfully boring and forgettable. It's just a massive disappointment overall, because these guys could do so much better than this. A project like Revolution Radio, their last record from 2016, while I wasn't as in love with that record as a lot of other people were, I still felt like it was a really solid release, and it showed that these guys could put out some quality material in the present day and age. But this record here doesn't have any of the strengths of that project. Everything about this thing is just really forgettable and bland. The instrumentals are really bland. The vocal performances aren't really anything all that special. The hooks aren't catchy in the slightest. The lyrics don't have anything going for them at all. Nothing really deep or insightful or quirky or funny or just anything at all that has character to it. They just kind of exist for the most part. And that's really the case for this record as a whole. It just kind of feels like it exists. It doesn't really add anything to the world by existing. It just, it's there, but that's all I could really say about it. The really short runtime of this thing just adds to the really carefree nature of it all, I guess, and it just ends up feeling super forgettable. And not to say that short albums are always carefree or anything like that. Believe me, when we get to my best of the year list, I have a few releases on there that are relatively short, some that are even shorter than this album. But those projects have interesting things going for them in their short run times, whereas this record has nothing going for it. Like the fact that this project is as forgettable as it is, I think really speaks for how just not good it is, I guess, because even projects like the trilogy, which I didn't like either, at least those three records, stuck with me in some way. It wasn't always a good way, but they still stuck with me. This, outside of those, that short period of time when I was listening to this thing in order to review it back in February, this project just has not been on my mind at all throughout the course of this year. And if it's just some random album from some artist I never heard before, that's one thing. But this is, like I said before, one of my favorite bands of all time. A band that is super important to me as a music fan. And the fact that this thing barely played a role in my 2020, yeah, I think that really says more than any actual description of this record really could. So yeah, this record was super disappointing. I mean, it's not the worst album in existence or anything, but yeah, it just left no impact on me, which for a band like this, it should have left some kind of impact. These guys could do much better at this point in time. A project like Revolution Radio proves that. They could still put out quality music, and this isn't it really. But yeah. Moving on though, for my next pick on the list, we're actually going to be doing something a little bit different, because the next two picks, number 2 and number 1 on my list, I think it's more appropriate to talk about these together, kind of as one big thing, given that they're both from the same artist and that they both share lots of similar qualities to them. Yeah, if you can't already tell, without any further ado, we get to my bottom 2 picks for the list. So if it's not already clear, on this channel I'm going to be treating these deluxe edition versions of albums that are basically their own album as, their own album, because like I just said, that's basically what they are. And in the case of Music to Be Murdered By and its expansion, these two were not a particularly good couple of projects, and probably the worst two that Eminem has dropped so far, in my opinion. I've seen some people say that Revival is worse than either of these two, and I can certainly understand why some people would have that opinion, because I still think that's a pretty terrible record too, and I think it had a worse impact on Eminem's career as a whole. But out of all the projects he's dropped so far, one thing that really stood out to me about Music to Be Murdered By, as well as its expansion, is that these records feel really aimless and without much of a reason to exist when compared to something like Revival or Kamikaze, or even Encore, if you want to go back that far into his career, if you're talking really bad albums. For example, Revival was trying to start something new for Eminem, start a new chapter in his career. I mean, it failed miserably, but at least it tried to do that, and it kind of has an identity because of it. Kamikaze was also a bad record in my opinion, but that record had a pretty clear-cut goal, with it being made in reaction to Revival. I didn't really like the concept behind that project by any means, but it certainly existed. But here with these two records, there's just not really much going on here. I mean, it feels like a mishmash of different ideas Eminem has done before, but it all sounds really terrible. The instrumentals here on this project suck. Some of them sound really cheap as well, way cheaper than an artist like Eminem should have on a project. The hooks across these records are pretty terrible. Eminem's rapping is technical, but not very good sounding. He says, things in a really technical way, but unlike an artist like A$AP Rock or like an MF Doom, he doesn't really have a good sound to his voice when he's rapping really technically, and he just comes across as sounding like constipated as opposed to really cool or anything like that, and it just doesn't really sound good to the ear. The features on these two projects for the most part aren't really good either. There are some on the original release of the project that are kind of like okay, I guess, maybe even some of the best moments across these two projects, but there's also some other features that just suck, and on the deluxe version of this thing, it sucks even more. And the lyrics here are probably the worst Eminem has had so far to date too, because they just don't really have much going for them. There's attempts at humor that aren't very funny. There's attempts at being shocking that are just eye-roll worthy. There's attempts at being deep and emotional that don't really land all that nicely. There's moments where he's making fun of like the new class of rappers, which just comes across as being kind of bitter, maybe a little petty at times, and just really confusing at other times too, because there's also moments on these projects where he's going over some more traditional trap production or teaming up with some of these modern artists, and it just doesn't really seem like there's much rhyme or reason to what he's doing. There's so many moments on these projects that can feel kind of contradictory like this, and when listening to the side B, I came to a realization as to why I didn't really like these two projects and why I think they're probably the weakest in his catalog as a whole. And that's just because, like I said before, they don't really have much of a purpose to them, unlike previous releases. And it just seems like he's trying to do so much, but not really doing any of it all that nicely. Like, a lot of the contradictions on these projects really showcase it. Like, there'll be moments where he's, there's like one track on the side B where he's apologizing to Rihanna for some lyrics that of his that leaked, where he said some not so great things about her, and he's trying to be all apologetic in that regard. But there's other moments on this project where he's trying to be offensive and making fun of people for being offended at him. There's also moments on the project where he's making jokes about very serious issues, but other moments where he's playing these very serious issues straight and trying to be serious about them. There's moments, like I said before, where he's making fun of newer rappers, but in other moments he's trying to imitate them or teaming up with them, and he doesn't really seem like he has much of a personality in that regard. You get so many different kinds of songs on these projects. You'll get like shocking horrorcore tracks that try to appeal to fans of some of those from his earlier material. You'll have tracks that feel a bit more in tune with like maybe like an old head would like, outside of even just like the making fun of like the newer rapper stuff on this thing. You'll have tracks, like I said before, where he'll try to appeal to newer rap fans with newer sounds. There's moments where he's trying to tackle very serious issues in some of his songs, where he's trying to appeal to maybe those rap fans that like really deep stuff in their lyrics. There's moments on this thing where he's trying to appeal to people who like maybe some of the popular stuff he put out like in the earlier 2010s with like the really poppy hooks and stuff like that. It feels like he's trying to make a song for anyone and everyone on this thing, but he doesn't do any of it all that nicely, and that combined with a lot of the lyrics on this thing feeling really all over the place, it feels like these two records don't really have much of a personality to them, to be honest. It just feels like he's trying to do a lot. I don't know, maybe it's because he wants feedback on what he should be focusing on going forward from his fans and audience, but he's just not getting that reception because a lot of his fans are diehards that love everything he does, and a lot of his critics just really hate everything that he does, so he doesn't get much distinct feedback for what he should be doing going forward. Or maybe he just wants to appeal to all these people at the same time, and is just trying to put all of that on a record because of it. I don't know, but it just leads to this thing having very little personality. And that, combined with a lot of the other problems I said before, leads to these two albums feeling like an absolute chore to get through. Like I said before, the most enjoyable moments across these projects are like some of the features on the original release of this project, and even some of those are just okay for the most part. Yeah, I did not enjoy these one bit. So yeah, we end off my 2020 year-end worst albums list with a couple of projects that were pretty bad, though honestly they just kind of feel like forgettable pieces of work, much like a lot of the other stuff on this list, to be honest. They're not the kind of projects that I get angry with as much as I just feel tired by their existence, or I just forget about them immediately after listening to them, which I guess kind of sums up my whole experience with listening to bad music in 2020, but I guess I really shouldn't complain. I mean, it could be worse. The actual music could be so bad that it just doesn't leave my brain. And in a year like 2020, I guess that would only make things worse because, like I said before, there was plenty of bad stuff to go around in 2020. I don't think the music being bad was one of those things that should have been added to that mix. But yeah, that sums up my list pretty nicely. Again, everything here is just my own personal opinion when it comes to these projects, so if you happen to disagree with any of my takes, that's perfectly fine. In fact, as I also said before, feel free to leave your own thoughts on these albums or share your own list of worst albums in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Of course, I'm going to be having my other year-end list come out soon, sometime this month. We have best albums, best EPs, and best songs coming up. So if you want to hear, the good stuff from this year, make sure you stay tuned for that because there was quite a lot of good music to come out in 2020, and you do not want to miss out on that stuff. The stuff that we talked about here today, this is stuff I'm going to forget about in a few months' time, but the stuff I'm going to be talking about in those videos, that's the stuff that you need to hear. So yeah, make sure you stick around to see those. Again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.